Beneath a federal office building in Lower Manhattan lies the largest colonial-era African cemetery uncovered in America. And when scientists studied the people buried there, the bodies told a story the shipping records denied. The Dutch documents said New York's enslaved came from one part of Africa, but the bones carried the signature of somewhere else entirely, a place thousands of miles away that no slave ship bound for New York was ever supposed to reach. Either the official record was wrong, or there was a route history had quietly erased. The truth turned out to be the second one. In 1991, construction crews broke ground for a federal building at 290 Broadway, in the heart of Lower Manhattan, a few blocks from City Hall. As they dug, they hit coffins, then more coffins. What they had stumbled into was a forgotten burial ground, where, across the late 1600s and 1700s, the enslaved and free Africans of colonial New York had laid their dead to rest. Archaeologists eventually recovered the remains of 419 people and estimated that the full cemetery, paved over and built upon centuries ago, may hold the bodies of 15,000 or more. It is the oldest and largest such site ever found in North America. The discovery touched off a fierce public fight. The federal government wanted its building. Black New Yorkers and a coalition of historians and clergy wanted the dead protected and studied with dignity, not bulldozed for office space. After protests, hearings, and a halt to construction, the community won. The remains will be examined, but on the descendants' terms, by scholars they trusted. The remains were entrusted to a research team at Howard University, the historically black university in Washington, led by the anthropologist Michael Blakey, with skeletal biologist Leslie Rankin Hill among the project's leaders. Their final reports, published in 2009, ran to thousands of pages. This was not casual work. It was the most ambitious study of an enslaved population ever attempted in the United States, drawing on skeletal analysis, dental study, bone chemistry, and early genetic testing all at once. The team built its entire investigation around 4 questions chosen in consultation with the descendant community: where these people came from, how hard their lives had been, how they had transformed from Africans into African Americans, and how they had resisted. But the first question, the one that would unravel everything, was the simplest and the most haunting. Where had these people come from? To understand why the answer was a shock, you have to know what the record said it should be. New York began as a Dutch town. It was founded as New Amsterdam in the 1620s, the trading post of the Dutch West India Company. And from almost the very start, that company built the colony's economy on enslaved African labor. The first documented group of enslaved Africans arrived around 1626, 11 men recorded under names like Paulo Dangola, Simon Congo, and Anthony Portuguese. Those names are not decoration. They are a map. They point straight to West Central Africa, the Congo, and Angola, the same regions the Dutch were raiding and trading along the Atlantic coast. As the colony grew, and even after the English seized it in 1664 and renamed it New York, it became one of the largest centers of urban slavery anywhere in the American colonies, second in the British mainland only to Charleston. And the labor of these people is built into the city's bones. Enslaved Africans cleared the forests of Manhattan, laid its earliest roads, and helped raise the defensive wall along the northern edge of the Dutch town, the wall that gave Wall Street its name. By the 18th century, enslaved people made up a substantial share of the city's population, and a large fraction of New York households held at least one person in bondage. This was not a Southern institution that the North merely tolerated from a distance. New York was a slave city, hands-on and dependent, and the cemetery at 290 Broadway was the resting place of the very workers who had made it rise. The Dutch had even experimented with a system they called half-freedom, granting some enslaved people a conditional, revocable liberty that could be snatched back, and that bound their children to the company, a bureaucratic cruelty unique to the colony. So the paper trail was clear and consistent. The shipping data, the company records, the names themselves. All of it pointed to West and West Central Africa as the homeland of New York's enslaved, with a large share passing through the Caribbean to be seasoned before being sold north. Historians working alongside the burial ground team confirmed the broad shape of it. Roughly a third of the city's 18th century African population had been born in Africa, while most of the rest had spent time in the islands first. That was the expected answer. West Africa, West Central Africa, the Caribbean. A clean Atlantic story. The bodies refused to tell that clean story. When the researchers read the biological evidence from the people themselves, the origins fanned out far wider than the Atlantic records allowed. There were the expected signatures of West Africa and West Central Africa. Yes, the team could see, in the bones and teeth and burial customs, the cultural fingerprints of specific peoples, the Akan of the Gold Coast, the Igbo of the Niger Delta, and others scattered across the western half of the continent. The dead of New York were not a single people, but a forced gathering of many. But woven among them was something that should not have been there at all. Markers pointing toward the island of Madagascar, off the southeastern coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean, not the Atlantic, the other ocean. A place separated from New York's documented slave routes by the entire length of the African continent and the storms of two seas. By every rule of the standard account, that was impossible. No slave ship in the West African trade sailed to Madagascar. The island sat thousands of miles outside the system that fed the Atlantic. If you traced the Dutch and English shipping ledgers for New York, you would never, ever arrive at Madagascar. And yet there it was, written into the remains of people who had lived and died and been buried in colonial Manhattan. The records said one ocean, the bodies said two. Something in the official history was missing. It is worth sitting with how strange that is. We tend to treat written records as the hard evidence in human memory, or biology as the soft, unreliable part. Here it was the reverse. The documents, the proud, careful ledgers of a trading empire, were the thing that lied, or at least left out. The bodies were the thing that told the truth. A whole population's origin had been misfiled by history, and the only place the correct version survived was inside the cells and the teeth of the people it had happened to. To find out where these New Yorkers really came from, no one could simply pull a file. They had to ask the dead directly. Before we follow that thread to its disturbing end, it helps to understand how scientists can pull a homeland out of a body in the first place. There are two main tools, and the trick to both is that the body keeps records the person never knew they were carrying. The first is mitochondrial DNA. Think of it as a kind of surname that is passed down only along the mother's line, from a mother to all her children, then onward through her daughters, almost unchanged for thousands of years. Because it barely mutates, that maternal signature can be matched against populations in different parts of the world, hinting at the deep ancestral region a person's mother's mother's mother came from. The second tool is even stranger. As a child's teeth form, they lock in tiny chemical traces from the water they drink and the soil their food grows in, and those traces, called strontium and oxygen isotopes, vary from region to region across the earth. It works like a chemical postmark, stamped into the enamel in childhood and never erased. Test the tooth, and you can tell roughly what part of the world someone spent their earliest years in, whether they were born in Africa or in the Americas. Put those tools together, layer them with the patterns of deliberate dental filing practiced in specific African cultures, and the team could do something close to reading a passport written in bone. It was that combined reading, not any single test, that kept pointing some of these New Yorkers back toward the Indian Ocean. There was even physical evidence of the journey itself etched into the skeletons. Many bore the marks of brutal labor, begun far too young, spines compressed, muscle attachments torn and rebuilt from hauling loads no child should carry, teeth worn down by stress and hunger. Some showed signs of having been born and raised in Africa before being wrenched across an ocean as adults. Others had clearly grown up enslaved in the Americas from birth. The bones did not just hold a homeland, they held a biography. And for a great many of them, that biography began somewhere the official New York records insisted it could not have. So how did people from Madagascar end up buried under Lower Manhattan when no record of the Atlantic trade could explain it? The answer is a piece of New York history that was buried almost as thoroughly as the cemetery itself. In the late 1600s, New York's merchants found a loophole and they drove a fortune through it. The lawful African slave trade on the Atlantic coast was monopolized by England's Royal African Company, which squeezed out independent traders. So the city's most powerful merchants simply went around it, around the entire continent, to the Indian Ocean, and to Madagascar, which lay outside the company's reach. The man at the center of it was Frederick Philips, born Frederick Fleipson in the Dutch Republic, who had come to New Amsterdam as one of Peter Stuyvesant's carpenters and clawed his way up to become one of the richest men in the colony. In his own words, written to one of his captains in 1695, it was by trading in enslaved people that he found his chief profit. Everything else, he said, was incidental. Phillips financed a network of ships and worked hand in glove with outright pirates, men like Adam Baldridge, who ran a trading post on an island off Madagascar, and captains like Samuel Burgess and Thomas Mostyn, who sailed from New York around Africa to buy human beings on the Malagasy coast and carry them back to be sold in the city. The economics were obscene. A captive could be bought on Madagascar for a few shillings worth of goods and sold in the colonies for 30 pounds or more, a profit margin so steep it drew a whole class of New York merchants into the Indian Ocean. Phillips supplied the pirate settlements with food, rum, weapons and ammunition, and even Bibles, and took payment in bullion, East India goods, and human beings. On one voyage in 1698, his ship, the Margaret, loaded more than 100 captured Malagasy men for New York. Though that particular cargo never arrived, British authorities seized the ship over its pirate ties, and the captives were sold off at the Cape of Good Hope instead. This was a smuggler's trade, illicit and discreet, kept off the official Atlantic ledgers precisely because it broke the monopoly. By around 1701, a crackdown on piracy had largely shut the Madagascar route down. But for a crucial generation, it had funneled an unknown number of Malagasy people into colonial New York, and it had done so almost entirely in the dark, which is exactly why the standard records of who was shipped to New York never showed it, and exactly why the bodies in the burial ground knew something the documents did not. The DNA had not contradicted the truth. It had preserved a truth the paperwork was designed to hide. Now I owe you some honesty about the limits here, because this is where credibility is either earned or thrown away. Michael Blakey himself was blunt about the science. DNA, he cautioned, is sloppy. It gives a broad range of possibilities, not a pinpoint. And in the early 1990s, when this work began, the reference libraries of African DNA were thin, which made firm conclusions about a single individual's exact origin genuinely hard. That is why the team never leaned on genetics alone. The Madagascar finding holds up because several independent lines of evidence point the same way: the genetic markers, the chemical postmarks in the teeth, the cultural practices written on the bones, and because, crucially, the documented history of New York's Indian Ocean trade gives those biological signals a real-world explanation. When the body and the archive finally agree, after one was hidden and the other was lying, that agreement is worth something. It is also true that no one knows exactly how many Malagasy people were brought to New York. The smuggling left thin paperwork by design. The point is not a precise head count. The point is that the population was more global, more varied and stranger than the tidy Atlantic version ever admitted. The enslaved of colonial New York were Congolese and Angolan and Akan, and also, against every expectation, Malagasy from the far side of the continent. And there is one more reason to trust this finding rather than dismiss it. The same pattern keeps surfacing elsewhere. In 2023, a separate team published a community-engaged ancient DNA study of 18th century African-descended people unearthed in Charleston, South Carolina, and found a startling diversity of African origins among just a few dozen individuals, a range far wider than any simple regional label. New York is not a fluke. Wherever scientists have managed to read the bodies of the enslaved directly, the same truth emerges. The trade scattered people from more corners of Africa by more routes than the surviving paperwork ever bothered to record. The records were not just incomplete, they were systematically incomplete in a direction that always made the trade look simpler and tidier than the human reality it concealed. If you've come this far, you already know what this channel does. It takes the version of history that got simplified into a single clean line and goes looking for the parts that were paved over. If you want more of that, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely decides whether work like this keeps reaching people. Then stay with me, because the last part is the reason any of this matters. Because here is what those 419 people actually accomplished, lying silent under a city street for 300 years. They corrected the record, not with a document or a testimony, but with their own bodies. Bodies that remembered an origin the ledgers had erased, a homeland the smugglers had tried to keep off the books, an ocean the textbooks left out. For 3 centuries, the official story of who built New York was incomplete, and the people best positioned to complete it were the ones who had been silenced most completely, the enslaved themselves. And when science finally learned how to listen, it was those silenced people who supplied the missing chapter. The dead testified, the living finally heard. In 2003, after a long fight led by Black New Yorkers who refused to let the site be paved back over, the remains were carried home in hand-carved coffins and reburied with honor in a ceremony called the Rites of Ancestral Return. School children lined the route. The coffins traveled through several cities before coming back to the ground where they had lain. A few years later, in 2006, the ground was designated a national monument and a memorial rose on the spot, a permanent acknowledgement in the heart of the financial district that the wealth around it was built in part by people buried beneath it. The people who had been treated as cargo, recorded as property, and forgotten as inconvenient were finally acknowledged as what they always were, the founders of a city that had spent centuries trying not to remember them. And for their descendants, the science offers something quietly profound. A New Yorker tracing African ancestry today might find the expected threads back to Congo or Angola, but some may carry a line that reaches instead toward an island in the Indian Ocean, proof of a journey so improbable that history had simply declined to record it. For families who have spent generations with the trail going cold at the auction block, that is not trivia. It is a door opening onto a homeland that was stolen twice, once when the person was taken and again when the record was erased. That ancestry was never truly lost. It was only waiting in the bone for someone to learn how to ask. The science here doesn't sensationalize any of this. It does something harder and more useful. It shows that the record of a crime, written by the people who profited from it, will always leave things out, and that sometimes the only honest witnesses left are the victim's own remains. New York's slave trade reached around the entire planet and then hid the evidence. The bodies, in the end, kept it anyway. That is the part worth carrying with you. Every official record is also a record of what someone chose to leave out, and the people most likely to be left out are always the ones with the least power to insist on being seen. For 300 years, the men who counted New York's wealth never counted the Malagasy in their own households as people with a homeland worth noting. It took a construction crew, a community that would not back down, and a team of scientists reading bone like a manuscript to put them back into the story. The lesson is not only about the past, it is a reminder that the tidy version of any history is usually the version written by whoever had something to gain from leaving things out, and that the fuller truth is often still there, waiting, in the evidence they couldn't bring themselves to destroy. If this rewrote what you thought you knew about early America, the next video follows that other ocean, the Indian Ocean slave trade the Atlantic story forgot, the one that scattered Malagasy and East African ancestry into places no one thinks to look, from the Americas to the islands of the Caribbean to the ports of the Middle East. It was older than the Atlantic trade. It lasted longer, and almost no one was ever taught it existed. What the DNA is revealing about it now is only beginning. That story is waiting for you. I'll see you there.